Hello, and welcome to the first tutorial in a series of deep dives into concepts in Auragen that will show us how to use the various systems for making visuals. Today we'll be going over a particle system tutorial, which will show you how I made this exact scene and introduces a few concepts that we want to know for understanding particle systems in Auragen. We'll be going over the particle system root node, emitters, effectors, renderers, materials, environments, cameras, and using these modifier nodes to drive parameters. So now that we see what we're going to be working with, let's start with a new scene with the control N. And the first thing we want to do is drag in an output node. Once we have an output and we confirm that our scene is playing in the bottom left, we'll want to add a particle system. When you drag the output from the particle system to the output, you won't see anything immediately, and there are two reasons for this. The first is that our particle system here is simply a root node that needs to have an emitter and a renderer in order to emit particles and show something for those particles in the output. If we drag out from our emitter and select a basic emitter, we'll see that we have a sphere that is emitting particles. Now, we don't see those particles yet because there is no geometry to render. If we drag out a renderer and select a point geometry renderer, we now see that we have particles that are coming in and out of view, but they're pretty hard to see. The reason for that is because we don't really have any lighting in our scene. What I'm going to do here is add an environment node, which adds some basic lighting to our scene. Now you can see these nodes popping in and out a little bit more clearly. However, this lighting is pretty static, and I want to make sure that we have some more colors to work with based on our environment. I will select an HDRI in this case, which will allow for a little bit more dynamic lighting. And once we add materials and camera movement, that will really showcase the colors of the environment. I like this Shanghai HDR, which I believe you can find on HDR Haven. If we open that, we'll now see that we have some more lighting. When you click the Show Skybox button in the environment node, you can actually see the HDRI in the background. I really like this one because it adds a lot of color and light to the scene, which you can see kind of vaguely gets caught on the actual geometry here. But nothing's really moving. We have some geometry that is popping in and out of view because these particles are being rendered, but they're not moving at all. What we want to do here is add in effectors. Effectors are going to affect and move the points around in various ways. When you drag out from the effectors node, you can see that we have different options to drag in. I'm going to use the explode effector, which is going to take our geometry and push the particles out from the center of this emitter. I'm going to change the emitter from a sphere to a point. Now we have one single point that's outputting our particles, and they're exploding outwards in all directions. In addition to the explode effector, I'm going to drag in a shockwave effector. This shockwave effector is going to add a bit more explosion to the scene. Every 3 seconds, it's going to explode outward. And we can reduce the strength a little bit here to, let's say, 5. So we have a bit more of a slow explosion effect. Now, in addition to the explode and shockwave effectors, I want to drag in another effector to add some more dynamic particle movement. In this case, I will be using a twist effector. And make sure that when you're searching for nodes that you click the one that is listed under particle effectors. For example, if I click the twist and add a surface deformer, that's going to give us a different effect from what we're actually looking for. So when I bring in this twist effector, you'll notice that when I click the handle here to drag out a new wire, it automatically adds effectors 2 to the particle system. You can add multiple effectors, and as you'll see soon, multiple renderers to any particle system. This twist effector, as you can see, twists some of the particles that are coming our way. However, this twist is fairly strong and doesn't really have a stickiness that I want for my scene. So what I'll be doing is adding in another effector, which is the fluid effector. Now, right away, you can see that this makes everything too sticky. The apply mode is on velocity, and our stickiness is at 18. We're going to bring that way down to about a 1.5. Now we'll see that the fluid effector is applying to our twist, but it's not applying to the shock wave and explode, which is what we actually want in this case. Now our geometry, as you can see here, is kind of choppy. It's a little bit low poly and low resolution. So if we go into our point geometry renderer, we have a UV sphere, which is the type of geometry that we're rendering for each of these points. If I make that an icosphere, you'll see that it's a little bit more sharp and angular, or a box, if you want to have some pixelated look to your particles. I'm going to keep it at an UV sphere and bring up the subdivision to 2. So now we have some nice smooth circles and spheres in our scene. The particle system itself has a default particle count that is a little bit low for what I want. I'm going to crank this up to 75,000. So now we have a lot more particles. You can play around with a lot of the parameters in here, such as the life randomness, spawn grow, and death shrink. Once we crank up these values, you'll see that the particles are growing as they spawn in, and they are shrinking as they die out of the scene. The die rate can also be adjusted so that our particles don't die as frequently. I'll keep this at about a 0.25 in this case. So now we have a scene that looks closer to what we are actually envisioning. But the particles are still just this solid gray that don't have any sort of impact on the visuals except for catching the lighting of the scene. To really add a lot of dynamic view to this particular scene, we're going to add a glass material. Now this glass material has a lot of different parameters that you can play around with. You'll immediately see its effect on the scene, and if I drag the camera around, we're actually looking through the particles because they're glass, and you can see the HDRI in the background. It shows up especially well when you look at that city, which if we look at the environment, is over here. And if you turn off the show skybox again, you'll see that the HDRI is now showing through the particles. If I go back into this glass material and adjust some of the values, such as the index of refraction, set that to 1.234, why not? And add a little bit of roughness for some frost effect. Change the thickness of these to a little bit lower, and add in some chromatic aberration and attenuation. You'll now see a very different look than what we started with. I actually think in this case the thickness should stay at about 0.5. If you want to color the glass material in a way that's going to be a bit more consistent and not have the colors simply applied from the HDRI, we can choose an emissive color here. I'm going to choose this teal blue and set our emissive intensity to 1.25. Now that's clearly a little bit too strong, so simply dragging this value down is going to allow us to see a bit of that blue color without completely washing out our scene. I think about a 0.15 in this case gives us that hint of teal without applying too much emissive strength. We also have the ability to illuminate the scene with that emission. I'm going to bring that value up to, let's say, a 5, and bring up the GI reach. So now we have a little bit more of that colorful light impacting the rest of the particles. Currently, this is set to just use the glass material on the front side of the particles. However, if we change that to back, you'll see that we have a different look, or double, to apply the glass material to the front and back of these particles. This is a bit closer to what I was envisioning. We can also add some clear coat and some roughness to these particles. And now we have a bit more of the movement from what we originally showed at the beginning of this tutorial. What we also want to add in here is a separate renderer to add a little bit of trails to our particles. If I search for a trail renderer and drag that in, you'll now see that we have trails added to our particle system. Now the trails are not exactly the color that I want to have, so I'm going to change this color mode to a gradient, which opens up our gradient selector here. I'll match the colors a little bit to our original scene. Let's go with this, actually, this gradient here. And we can change some of the parameters of the trail length to drop this down to, let's make that a 16, bring our thickness up to 5, and have a little bit of random width as well. Now that we have both the trail renderer and the point geometry renderer applying to our particle system, I think we can add some camera movement to make the scene a little bit more dynamic. If we click on this wire here and search for a camera, we now have a camera with different position options, modes for how to actually fly through the scene or move the camera around, and a blend mode as well. In this case, I'm going to be applying a few different concepts that are important to know for working with the camera. The first is the mode. In this case, I'm going to select the orbit. The orbit allows for holding the Alt key and dragging with the left mouse button to orbit around your center point. In this case, it's the point that's emitting our geometry and our particles. One of the cool things about the orbit mode is that at the very bottom, we have this auto rotate. If we type in a 1, you'll see that it's rotating pretty quickly around the scene, which is not exactly what we want in this case. I'm going to cut that down to a 0.1. So we have a slow orbit, which is going to change the way that the HDRI is displayed through our glass material here. If we set the yaw, pitch, and roll to 0, we're now centered around the origin of our scene. The FOV is going to make a big impact on this scene. It defaults to 40, and if we slide this up, we zoom out a little bit, but in this case, I'm going to want to bring this down to about 20. Now we're seeing a much more close-up look of our scene, and this allows for more detail that you can see in these particles. I think in this case we should add some roll to our camera. The best way to do this, besides simply clicking on the roll, would be to add a modifier. The modifiers are going to allow for mathematical operations that in this case can continuously apply a roll to our camera. I'll simply search for a continuous modifier, click on the camera node, and drag the output from the modifier onto the roll of our camera. Now there's a very slow application of roll that's happening here. So we can simply click on our continuous value and bring our speed up to 10. Now we have a faster roll that if we bump this up to, let's say 50, is much more noticeable, but a bit too intense. We'll keep this value at 10 for now. One of the coolest parts of this camera node is the depth of field. If we add depth of field, you'll see that there is a focus that applies to different parts of the scene. Typically, the autofocus is going to be very useful when you have a focus target, which we can apply like so. But in the case of this particular scene and the particles expanding so close to the camera, it's not exactly what we're looking for. So I'll get rid of this focus target and change this to manual distance. For this, we will drag our distance until we get the sharp look that we're looking for. There we go. And we'll bring our f-stop to something like 2.8. This is going to add a little bit more of a wide focus range to our scene. And our max blur in pixels by default is 32. I'm going to cut that down to 16, so we get a bit less of an intense blurring effect. Now that we have some depth of field added to our scene, I think we can change this focus distance to be a bit more dynamic as well, so that it focuses in and out of the 5.25 distance that we have here. I will select an LFO modifier, which is going to pulse between two values. In this case, it's going between 0 and 1. What we want to set in this particular example is a sine wave, this is going to go from -1 to +1. And we can drag out to a range remap where we can change the -1 input value and our +1 to whatever values we want for this particular application of the focus distance. I will set this between, well, let's say 5.25 and 6.5. Now we have an LFO that is modulating between those two values. We can adjust the speed of that LFO to 0.1 and drag the output from that modifier onto our manual distance focus. If we clear out the focus distance first and drag the modifier on, we now have the focus distance changing dynamically as we move through our scene. We can apply this same concept of LFOs to the particle system itself. If we bring in an LFO and drag the value of this LFO onto the speed of our scene, we'll now have a particle system that grows and shrinks dynamically with this moving LFO. Now, if I take this speed and set it to 0 and drag the LFO on, it's pulsing a bit too strong for what I'm actually looking for. So I'm going to take this value and set the speed to about a 0.2. Now we have a bit more of a slow change in how the particles are being born, how they move around the system, and how they are going to impact our scene. However, I don't really like that it's going between a 0 and a 1 where the particle system stops entirely. What I can do in this case is simply add another range remap, change this from a 0 to 1, and go between, let's say, 0.5 and 1.5. Now, if we drag the range remap onto the speed instead, and first disconnect this modifier, now we'll see that the entire system has a bit more dynamic of a look. You can apply this concept of modifiers to essentially any parameter within the node network that creates your patch. So now we have a dynamic scene that uses the particle system with an emitter creating particles, multiple effectors that move those particles through a scene, a point geometry renderer with a glass material applied, a trail renderer so we can add some nice colorful trails to our particles, an environment for color of the background of the scene and lighting, and a moving camera that adds some dynamic output to our scene. You can find the full patch that I created to originally inspire this tutorial in the description of this video. And if you have any further questions, feel free to check out the Discord for Auragen. And stay tuned for further tutorials on deep dives and quick tips as well on how to use Auragen for creating more visuals like this. Thanks for tuning in.